Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we are going to be tackling a topic that is very complex and a lot of times misunderstood, and that is addiction. And we are going to be looking at this through the lens of a book called The Biology of Desire: Why Addiction is Not a Disease by Mark Lewis.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book because it challenges, as you said, this sort of traditional disease model of addiction. And Lewis really argues that addiction is not so much about a diseased brain, but a brain that has learned some very, very powerful habits. Unfortunately, these habits can be incredibly destructive.
Yeah, and to illustrate this point, he uses stories of 5 different people, all of whom have struggled with different types of addiction. We have Natalie, Brian, Donna, Johnny, and Alice. And it's really their experiences that help bring this whole discussion to life.
And their stories really, I think, highlight the point that addiction can develop in anybody, even people who seem to have it all together. And it's not as simple as a sign of weakness or a character flaw. It's really this complex interplay between how our brains work, our life experiences, and these intense desires that we all have that can sometimes, really take over.
Right. And before we dive into the individual stories, let's talk about this idea of the disease model versus Lewis's perspective. We hear a lot about addiction being a chronic brain disease.
Yeah, that's right. The idea is that repeated exposure to drugs or alcohol actually changes the brain. And there's a lot of truth to that. Especially there's a region of the brain called the striatum that plays a really big role in our motivation and reward. And because of these changes, people say, well, addiction must be a disease.
But Lewis really pushes back against that idea. He says that those brain changes don't necessarily mean disease. It's more about learning and habit formation, even if those habits are really destructive.
That's exactly right. And he
Mhm.
points out that our brains are incredibly adaptable. They're constantly changing and rewiring themselves based on our experiences. And so addiction, he argues, is a form of intense learning where the brain really becomes wired for those immediate rewards of the substance or the behavior.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea of intense learning a bit.
Yeah.
How does this actually happen in the brain? What's going on in there?
Okay, well, let's imagine the brain's reward system, like a network of pathways. And so every time we do something that's pleasurable, whether it's eating a delicious meal or spending time with loved ones, this neurotransmitter called dopamine gets released. And dopamine is our brain's way of saying, hey, that felt good, let's do it again.
So it's like dopamine is our own personal cheerleader in our brains. It's encouraging us to repeat the behaviors that make us feel good.
Exactly. But with drugs or addictive behaviors, that dopamine system goes into overdrive. The rewards are so intense, so immediate, that they really hijack our brain's natural learning process.
Oh, so it's like those pathways related to the addiction almost become like superhighways in our brain, while other paths leading to maybe healthier choices get neglected.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where Lewis introduces the concept of deep learning. He says that because the rewards in addiction are so powerful, the brain learns much faster and much more intensely, solidifying those addictive pathways.
That makes sense when you think about how quickly addiction can really take hold of someone's life. It's like their whole world really starts revolving around that substance or behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not even just the substance or the behavior itself, it's the whole ritual around it, the anticipation, the cues, the environment. All of it gets woven into this kind of intense learning process.
So it's not just about willpower then, is it? It's about understanding that the brain has really been fundamentally rewired through this deep learning process.
That's right. And that brings us to Natalie's story, which really highlights the power of desire and addiction.
Okay, so Natalie struggled with heroin addiction. Let's talk about how her story really illustrates this whole concept of deep learning.
Well, Natalie was not somebody you would typically associate with addiction. She had friends, a boyfriend, a job, but she also battled this constant anxiety. It was like this kind of shadow always lurking beneath the surface for her.
And she described heroin as offering this, quote, approaching brightness, an arrow of hope. It's almost poetic, but also heartbreaking when you think about the reality of her situation.
And that is a perfect example of now appeal in action. That feeling of hope, of relief that heroin offered her, it was so immediate and so intense that it really overwhelmed any consideration of the long-term consequences.
Right. It's like her brain learned to associate heroin with relief from her anxiety.
Yeah.
And it craved that relief more than anything else.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the heroin itself, it was the whole ritual of injecting it that became intertwined with that sense of relief. The process of preparing the drug, finding a vein, the physical sensation of injecting it all became part of this learned reward cycle.
So her brain was essentially creating this feedback loop where each step in the ritual was reinforcing her desire for the drug.
Exactly. And as that cycle repeated, those pathways in her brain became stronger and stronger, making it harder and harder to resist the urge.
Yeah, it's almost like walking the same path every day. You eventually create this well-worn trail, and it's hard to deviate from it.
That's a great analogy. And in Natalie's case, that trail led her deeper and deeper into addiction.
And this is where Lewis's insights about the brain's reward system really come into play.
Yeah.
He talks about the specific regions that are involved in this cycle of desire and addiction.
Yes, he really focuses on a few key players. One is the nucleus accumbens. This is like the brain's pleasure center, and it gets flooded with dopamine when we experience something rewarding. And it plays a crucial role in motivation and habit formation.
So in Natalie's case, her nucleus accumbens was associating heroin with pleasure and relief, making it increasingly difficult to resist.
Exactly. And then there's the orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC. And this part of the brain is involved in evaluating the value of things, especially in the present moment.
So you could say it's our brain's worth it calculator.
Yes. And in addiction, the OFC becomes biased towards the drug or the behavior, making it seem incredibly valuable, even more valuable than things that are actually good for us.
So even though logically Natalie knew heroin was harmful, her OFC was telling her something different. It was saying, this is worth it. This will make you feel better.
Precisely. It's like the drug hijacks our brain's reward system and really distorts our perception of what's truly valuable, and that makes it so challenging to break free.
And this leads to another really crucial point that Lewis makes, which is the limitations of traditional rehab, at least from Natalie's perspective.
Yeah, she went through several rehab programs, but she actually found them to be pretty unhelpful. She felt like they were trying to fix her rather than really understanding her unique experience and helping her cope with those root causes of her addiction.
She described one rehab facility as this patched-up motel run by a few ex-addicts who figured they knew how to cure people because they themselves had quit.
Ouch. Yeah, it's a pretty harsh assessment. But it does highlight a common frustration with traditional rehab. It often relies on this one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't always address the individual's specific needs and the underlying, emotional issues that might be fueling their addiction.
And this is where Lewis's argument against the disease model becomes especially interesting. Because if you label addiction as a disease, it can create a sense of helplessness. It makes people feel like they have no control over their recovery.
Right. It's like saying, you have a broken brain and there's nothing you can do about it. But Lewis argues that we actually have more agency than that. Our brains are constantly changing and adapting, and even deeply ingrained habits can be unlearned.
So if it's not a disease, then what is it? And how do people actually overcome it?
That's what we're going to be exploring further as we dive into the stories of Brian, Donna, Johnny, and Alice. They each offer this unique perspective on the challenges and the triumphs of recovery. And they remind us that there is always hope for change, even in the face of addiction.
Stay tuned, because things are about to get even more fascinating as we unravel the biology of desire and the pathways to recovery. Natalie's story is such a powerful illustration of how desire and those immediate rewards can really hijack our brains.
Yeah.
And, it makes you realize that addiction is not as simple as making a choice.
Yeah, it's this complex interplay between those brain processes and our lived experiences. It all kind of comes together to create these really, really powerful urges that are so difficult to resist. And I think each story that we're talking about today really highlights different elements of that.
Absolutely. So now we're going to shift gears a bit and talk about Brian, who struggled with methamphetamine addiction. And his story brings up this concept of compulsion, which really adds another layer, I think, to understanding how addiction takes hold.
Yeah, what's interesting about Brian is that he initially started using meth almost as a tool. Like he was a really successful entrepreneur, working tons of hours, dealing with a failing relationship. And meth for him was a way to kind of keep going, to stay focused and energized.
So he was using it almost like a performance enhancer, pushing himself beyond his limits.
Exactly, and initially it seemed to work. But as with any addiction, that initial solution quickly turned into a problem. And those immediate effects of the drug, that intense focus, the energy, the feeling of being on top of the world, they started to outweigh everything else in his life.
And he described his life as shifting from this normal rhythm of sleep and wakefulness to this unearthly orbit where meth became like the central force that was really dictating his every thought and action.
Yeah, he was completely caught in the grip of that now appeal. That allure of that immediate reward was so powerful that it really just completely overshadowed any consideration of those long-term consequences. It's like his brain was saying, who cares about tomorrow as long as you feel incredible right now?
And that's where the compulsion comes in, right? Even though he knew that meth was harming him, he couldn't stop. It was like something else was really driving his actions.
Exactly. And it's almost like a switch flipped in his brain, and those really powerful urges just took over. And he described it as this cognitive mutation, this constant tugging at his thoughts, this overwhelming urge to use, even when he desperately wanted to stop.
And, we've been talking about the nucleus accumbens and the OFC, but what's going on in the brain when that compulsive behavior takes over? Is there another part of the brain that's involved?
Yes, there is. It's called the dorsal striatum. You can kind of think of it as the brain's habit center. The nucleus accumbens might be the one saying, hey, this feels good, but it's the dorsal striatum that's really turning those pleasurable experiences into these automatic habits.
Okay, so the more he used, the more his dorsal striatum was kind of taking over, making it harder and harder to resist those urges.
Precisely. It's like driving the same route to work every day. You do it so often you barely have to think about it anymore. It becomes automatic. And in Brian's case, that automatic behavior was using meth, even when it meant sacrificing things that were really important to him.
Like his relationship with his daughter, for example. He talked about how his addiction made it impossible for him to really spend any quality time with her.
Yes, and there's this really heartbreaking story he tells about being on his way to visit his daughter, but feeling this overwhelming urge to stop at his dealer's house first. And he knew it would cut into the time he had with her, but he just couldn't fight that compulsion.
And he basically said, everything I was doing had to do with the substance. Even my important relationships, like with my kid, I had to score beforehand when I was about to visit my daughter. So a 4-hour visit would become a 2-hour visit.
Yeah. And it's just this perfect example of how addiction can really distort our priorities and make the drug or the behavior, the most important thing in our lives, even more important than the people that we love.
It really challenges this idea that addiction is simply a matter of willpower. Like, it's not about being weak or lacking discipline. It's about these really powerful brain processes that can override even our best intentions.
Exactly. And Brian's story also brings up another really crucial element in addiction, which is the role of the amygdala. And the amygdala is the brain's fear center.
Okay, so now we're adding yet another player to this really complex kind of brain network. So what's the amygdala doing in all of this?
Well, the amygdala's job is to really alert us to danger. It's what's responsible for that fight or flight response that we all experience, when we feel threatened.
But how does that relate to addiction? I don't think of meth as being a physical threat in the same way that, like a predator might be.
Right. But in addiction, the amygdala actually becomes sensitized to the drug and to all the cues that are associated with it. And it starts to associate the drug with both pleasure and with relief from those withdrawal symptoms.
So it's almost like the amygdala saying, we need this drug to feel good, and we need it to avoid feeling bad.
Exactly. And that creates this really powerful double bind for somebody like Brian. Because on the one hand, he was drawn to the pleasurable effects of the meth, but on the other hand, he was absolutely terrified of the consequences of not having it.
So he was really caught between a rock and a hard place, with his amygdala sending out these urgent signals that he needed the drug to survive.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why addiction is so challenging to overcome. It's not just about wanting to quit. It's about rewiring those brain circuits and retraining the amygdala to stop associating the drug with survival.
But Brian's story does have a hopeful ending, right? He was able to kind of find his way out of that vicious cycle.
He did, and his recovery really highlights a crucial aspect of overcoming addiction, which is that need to reconnect with those long-term goals and values. And for him, he found solace in helping others. He actually started using his experience to support other addicts in their recovery.
It's like he had to find something bigger than himself, something that gave his life meaning and purpose beyond that kind of immediate gratification of the drug.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the importance of perspective taking. Remember, we talked about how addiction can kind of trap us in this immediate present. It blinds us to the bigger picture. And recovery often involves shifting that perspective, remembering who we are, what we value, and what we want our lives to be about.
It's about reclaiming our narrative. It's about rewriting that story of our lives with a new ending, one that doesn't revolve around the drug.
Absolutely. And that is such a powerful message of hope, I think, for anyone who is struggling with addiction. It's this reminder that change is possible, that even though addiction can feel like this life sentence, there's always a path to freedom.
And now I think it's time to hear Donna's story, which takes us in a slightly different direction. She was addicted to prescription painkillers. And her experience really underscores, I think, the insidious nature of addiction and how it can affect anyone, even those who seem to have it all together.
Yeah, Donna's story really challenges our assumptions about, who can become addicted and how addiction manifests. It's this reminder that there's no single face of addiction. There's no stereotype that fits everyone.
Absolutely. So let's dive into Donna's story and explore how it adds to our understanding of the biology of desire. Yeah, Donna's story is, like you said, a reminder that addiction can really sneak up on anybody. She was a successful nurse, married, seemingly had a perfect life, but, you know, underneath it all, she was dealing with a lot of anxiety and a lot of emotional pain.
It really does show you that sometimes addiction is hidden in plain sight. We often associate addiction with these very visible struggles, but Donna's story shows us that somebody can be really hurting while maintaining this facade of normalcy.
And for Donna, prescription painkillers really became her way of coping with those struggles. She started taking them for legitimate pain after a surgery, but then gradually it spiraled into this need for the pills just to numb her feelings and just to kind of get through the day.
It's a pretty common path, for prescription painkiller addiction. What starts as a way to manage physical pain, morphs into this reliance on the drug for emotional reasons. The pills kind of create this buffer between the person and their emotional pain, but ultimately that avoidance only makes things worse.
And she described it as the pills creating a wall between her and her emotions. It's like she was trying to build a fortress around herself to keep the pain out, but she ended up trapping herself inside.
Such a powerful image. And it really speaks to how addiction can offer this illusion of safety, this illusion of control, while ultimately leading to a loss of both.
And this is where I think the interplay between the different parts of the brain becomes really important. We talked about the striatum, driving desires and habits. We've talked about the amygdala, the fear center, sounding the alarm about threats. But what about the prefrontal cortex? Isn't that supposed to be the part of the brain that helps us make, those good decisions?
Yeah, the prefrontal cortex, think of it as the brain's executive control center. It's involved in planning, decision-making, impulse control, all those higher-level functions that allow us to make choices that are aligned with our long-term goals.
So in Donna's case, it sounds like her striatum was totally fixated on getting those pills, while her prefrontal cortex was really struggling to keep up.
That's a good way to think about it. Addiction really creates this tug of war in the brain. You have the striatum screaming, I want it, I need it now. And then you have the prefrontal cortex trying to say, wait, hold on a second, let's think about the consequences here.
And unfortunately, in addiction, that immediate gratification often wins out. It's like the drug hijacks the brain's reward system and makes it almost impossible to resist those cravings, even when we know they're harmful.
It really is. And it's not that people with addiction lack willpower or don't want to stop. It's that the drug has really fundamentally altered the way that their brain works, making it incredibly difficult to resist those urges.
And Donna really captures that sense of being trapped in her story. She describes this moment when her husband confronts her about her addiction. She says, "It doesn't matter," he said, his interrogation nearly finished. "You're going to call your parents and you're going to go into treatment right now. If you don't, I'm going to leave you." And there it was, finally, her worst fear, the shock of ice-cold water. She crumpled to the floor, the last of her defenses, the last of her strength, completely sapped. Terror washed over her in waves, each one followed by a sucking backwash of shame. Her body jerked with the thrust of these emotions. Her knees folded into her chest. Her eyes closed tightly. She could not bear to see him looking at her. Not now, not ever.
It's so raw and so honest. It really conveys that just utter despair and helplessness that can come with addiction.
It makes you realize it's not just a physical dependence. It's this emotional entanglement, this feeling of being completely overwhelmed by something that's totally beyond your control.
Absolutely. And Donna's story also raises an important question about traditional rehab. If it often fails to address the underlying emotional issues that are really fueling the addiction, what are the alternatives?
Right, because if it's not just about willpower, then just telling someone to just say no wasn't going to cut it.
Exactly. And that's where I think Johnny's story offers some valuable insights. He struggled with alcoholism, but his experience highlights that recovery is possible through self-discovery and a deeper understanding of our own emotional patterns.
Johnny's case is interesting because He didn't develop his drinking problem until he was in his 60s. He was a lifetime up to that point of just moderate social drinking.
Yeah.
So it really challenges that idea that addiction always follows this predictable path or starts at a young age.
It shows how much life events and circumstances can play a role. And for Johnny, it was a combination of a second divorce and increasing social isolation that seemed to trigger his descent into alcoholism. And alcohol became his way of coping with that pain of loneliness and feeling like his life lacked purpose.
And he describes this period as a descent into a self-imposed prison, where alcohol was his only companion. It's almost like he was using it to create a wall between himself and the world, just like Donna used painkillers to wall off her emotions.
Definitely a parallel there. Both of them were using substances to create that separation from things they couldn't cope with directly.
And this is where this concept of stimulus response learning comes in, right? Lewis argues that addiction, at its core, is this learned habit driven by these cues that trigger automatic responses.
Exactly. And in Johnny's case, those cues were things like feeling lonely, feeling bored, or even just having that empty glass in his hand. And over time, his brain learned to associate those cues with drinking, creating this almost irresistible urge to reach for alcohol.
It's like his brain had developed this shortcut, like between those triggers and the behavior. And that conscious decision-making part of his brain was completely bypassed because the habit had become so ingrained.
Yes, it's like the brain has developed this automated response. Cue, feeling lonely, response, drink alcohol. And that's what makes it so difficult to break free from addiction. It's not just about making a different choice, it's about rewiring those deeply ingrained habits.
And Johnny really captures that feeling of being trapped by his habits. He talks about how he would drink, even though he knew it was going to make him feel terrible the next day. He said, I would drink at that point because I didn't want to face myself, didn't want to be rational.
It's like he was trying to use the alcohol to silence that inner critic, that voice of reason that was telling him to stop. And addiction often becomes a way to just escape from the discomfort of our own thoughts and feelings.
So Johnny eventually kind of hits rock bottom and he decides to go to rehab. But even there, he found the experience to be somewhat impersonal and ineffective. He felt like it didn't really address his specific needs or get to the root of his drinking.
Yeah, he makes a pretty insightful critique of the program. He says they need to know why they drink and what triggers them to drink. Otherwise, treatment is useless.
It's like he's saying, don't just tell me to stop. Help me to understand why I'm doing this in the first place.
Exactly. And that's where I think the limitations of that disease model are really apparent. It tends to just focus on managing symptoms rather than exploring the underlying causes of the addiction.
So what was Johnny's path to recovery? How did he eventually break free?
Well, he ended up kind of finding his own way through therapy and a lot of self-reflection. He really started to connect the dots between past experiences, his own emotional patterns, and his drinking. It was this journey of self-discovery that allowed him to understand the roots of his addiction and start to make different choices.
So it sounds like he had to kind of rewrite his own story, create a new narrative where alcohol no longer held this central role.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us back to this transformative power of perspective taking. Remember we talked about how addiction can trap us in that immediate present? It blinds us to the bigger picture. And recovery often involves shifting that perspective, reconnecting with our values and envisioning a future beyond addiction.
And that shift in perspective is something we see in Alice's story as well. And she struggled with both anorexia and bulimia, which brings up that interesting point that addiction isn't just limited to substances. It can apply to behaviors as well.
Absolutely. And Alice's story really highlights how those same brain processes that drive substance addiction can also be at play in things like eating disorders, gambling addiction, compulsive internet use, you name it. It's all about that cycle of desire, reward, and reinforcement that we've been discussing.
And in Alice's case, her eating disorders really stemmed from this desire for control. She described her early struggles with anorexia as this attempt to control her body and her life in a world that felt chaotic and unpredictable.
She was seeking a sense of order and mastery in a life that felt totally out of control. And initially, restricting her food intake, it gave her that feeling. But as with any addiction, that pursuit of control eventually led to this loss of control as her eating disorders spiraled into the cycle of self-starvation and binging.
Yeah. It's like she was trying to outrun her anxieties by controlling her food intake, but she ended up trapped in what she called this merry-go-round of anxieties.
It's a common paradox in addiction. That thing that we seek to control often ends up controlling us. And in Alice's case, that need for control became an addiction in itself.
She describes her binging episodes as being triggered by these moments of intense anxiety, when all of her carefully constructed defenses would crumble. It's like her prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that's supposed to help us regulate our emotions and impulses, was being completely overwhelmed.
Exactly. And when that prefrontal cortex is overloaded, the amygdala kind of takes over, triggering that fight or flight response and driving those really impulsive behaviors as a way to cope with those overwhelming feelings.
So she was caught in this vicious cycle of trying to control her anxiety by controlling her food, but that control ultimately backfired, leading to more anxiety and more disordered eating.
It's heartbreaking. But thankfully, Alice, just like the others, was able to find her way out. And for her, she found help through group therapy, where she learned to connect her emotional patterns and that need for control to her eating disorders.
So it sounds like therapy provided her with this safe space to really explore those deeper issues and to develop healthier ways of coping with her anxiety.
It did, and it also allowed her to really challenge those negative thought patterns that were fueling her eating disorders. She realized that she didn't have to suppress her emotions or try to control everything in her life. She could learn to accept her imperfections, to be a little bit kinder to herself, and to find other outlets for her anxieties.
So once again, we see that power of perspective taking and recovery.
Yeah.
Alice had to learn to see herself and her life from a different angle, one that wasn't completely revolving around food and control.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that our struggles don't define us. We all have the capacity to change, to rewrite our narratives, and to create lives that are full of meaning and purpose. And that's really the heart of Lewis's message in The Biology of Desire. Addiction is not a disease, it's a powerful habit that's ingrained in the brain. But just like any habit, it can be unlearned.
It's such a hopeful and empowering message. It reminds us that even though addiction can feel like this insurmountable obstacle, there is a path to recovery.
The stories of Natalie, Brian, Donna, Johnny, and Alice teach us that recovery is possible. It's a journey that requires courage, compassion, and a willingness to really explore the deeper landscape of our own minds. But ultimately, it's a journey that's worth taking.
Absolutely. And their stories remind us that we're not alone in our struggles. There's hope, there's help, and there's a whole community of people who understand and are walking that path alongside us.
It's a reminder that we have the power to change our brains, rewrite our stories, and create a future filled with meaning and purpose.
This has been an incredible deep dive into the world of addiction and the biology of desire. We've learned so much from Mark Lewis's insights and from the stories of these 5 incredible individuals. And remember, there is always hope for change and a life beyond addiction.
If addiction can be learned, it can also be unlearned. Recovery is a journey of rewiring the brain towards a more fulfilling future.
And that's a powerful thought to leave with our listeners. And remember, if you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, you are not alone. There are resources available, there's help, and there is always hope.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.